I signed everything over to my caretaker. Say it out loud and it sounds like a confession, like I'd given up. But that's not the end. It was a deliberate move. The care room smelled of disinfectant and cold tea, a clean smell that tries to wash away memories. A nurse clipped a folder, the snap sounding steady like a clock. Maya stood beside me, warm hands, a quiet voice, the kind of person everyone relied on. She held my hand while the lawyer read the terms I'd already approved. Keys passed from hand to hand on a cheap ring. Metal hit metal, and the house I'd built suddenly became someone else's responsibility. My children smiled as they signed. Mark's grin was quick and confident. Lisa's smile was polite, like a staged photograph. They left with smiles, convinced they'd won. The little camera on the mantel looked harmless. Small things people always forget. But I didn't do this because I was confused. I did it on purpose. Before their paperwork reached their mailboxes, I sent an envelope. A small thing lying in a drawer, unopened. I have a tape, and I have another will. When those surface, everything they trusted will explode. Stay with me to the end. The final reveal will shock you, because the mercy I gave was never gentle. I was the kind of man who fixed what was broken. I poured concrete before dawn, stayed late to patch a roof, taught my kids how to swing a hammer, and how to tell a good day's work from a bad one. Mary and I raised them in that little house on Elm, paint peeling on the porch, the garden she loved out back. Mary's laugh is the thing I wake to in memory. After she died, the house felt like the last honest thing I had left. My oldest, Mark, moved through life like he expected applause. He wanted nicer cars, a better zip code, and he always looked at other people's success with thin, hungry eyes. Lisa, my daughter, polished her smile and learned how to make a first impression count. Reputation mattered to her more than family dinners. Alex, my son-in-law, or you could call him the middle child depending on the day, kept his counsel. Quiet, quick, the type who thinks 2 steps ahead and never shows the strain. Then there was Maya, who came to the house on a Tuesday to help with my laundry and never left. She's not family, but she stayed when it mattered. She kept my appointments, brought me tea, and learned my pills by color. At first it was little things. A toolbox that went missing after a weekend visit. A check that was cashed for me because it was easier that way. Mark said he'd handle the mortgage paperwork and then let months slide. Lisa took care of a stack of old receipts and never mentioned them again. Alex offered to go through the attic to help me downsize and came back with a suitcase he claimed was for charity. Those small pushes felt like nudges at the time. They told themselves, and me, it was for my good, that I couldn't manage the bills, that I needed peace. They spoke like caretakers. They signed like inheritors. Slowly, carefully, the center of my life started to wobble. I felt the shift in the way they looked at me, not as a man to sit with on Sundays, but as a thing to arrange around and dispose of as convenient. One night, after a long day of wondering how I'd lost the things I loved, I started to keep receipts. I put a camera and a clock on the mantle. I slipped a small recorder into a fake book. I stopped trusting whispered reassurances. I was a father, and they treated me like a problem to be solved. That realization hardened me. I began to collect evidence the way I once collected nails, patient, steady, and with purpose. The lawyers arrived on a Tuesday like they were delivering a verdict. 2 men in suits, folders thick with print, faces practiced to look neutral. Maya squeezed my hand as they unfurled the papers across my kitchen table. Her touch was calm, steady, the anchor in the storm. My children stood around us, smiling the kind of smiles that say business, not love. Mark signed first, pen swift and sure. Lisa followed, gentle and polite, like she was completing a form for an event. Alex nodded and scrawled his name without looking up. Keys passed between them on a cheap ring. Metal clicked, and the sound felt small and final. For a moment, I was stunned. The lovely, sinking kind of shock that makes your stomach fold. Then humiliation arrived, heavy and hot, as if someone had announced my obsolescence aloud. People in the street would say, "He's in good hands now," as if I were a broken appliance. But the humiliation sharpened into something colder. Clarity slid across my mind like ice. I saw the faces around the table as chess pieces, not children. I signed the papers, not because I'd given up, but because I was moving pieces into position. If they thought they'd won, they hadn't seen the board I set. I watched the look on their faces the moment the papers were filed. Fury flickered there first, quick and sharp, the kind that comes from being outranked in a game you thought you controlled. Mark's jaw tightened. Lisa's smile thinned. Alex blinked, then tried to mask it with a casual shrug. Outrage leaked into the small town like a stain. Neighbors called, friends texted. At the diner, someone I'd known for 30 years tapped the salt shaker and said, "Tough break, huh?" As if the house had been repossessed by a bank. Suddenly everyone had an opinion, and they took sides. Some saying I'd made a good choice, others whispering that I'd been taken advantage of. The first gossip was the feedstock of everything that followed. What surprised me wasn't the anger, but the way it turned inward. They began accusing each other in hushed tones. "He tried to bribe her," one would hiss. "She's cozying up to Maya for a cut." The entitlement mutated into paranoia. Sibling against sibling. I let them have those early days to gnaw at one another. Small arguments became loud when pride is on the line. I fed those flames like a careful smoker tends embers. A neighbor, by mistake, mentioned seeing Lisa at the bank the week before. A petty note, but enough to make Mark check his accounts. I watched as suspicion pushed them to make reckless choices, quick withdrawals, late-night messages typed out like confessions. The more they turned on each other, the less they looked outward. They forgot to look at me. One evening, Mark emailed a screenshot accusing Alex of offering cash to Maya. It wasn't true, but he believed it long enough to act, and his action would leave a paper trail. That small, foolish email was the first crack I needed. Once they began to suspect, I worked like a locksmith on their trust. 2 pieces of paper, a forged invoice, and a fabricated text thread quietly moved through their lives like weeds. I didn't need the lies to be perfect, only plausible. The invoice used a local letterhead and a date when Mark had been out of town. The text thread hinted at a plan to secure Maya's help with a private payment. I sent each document to the sibling who would be most poisoned by it. Late that night, I sat by the window and watched shadows pass my yard, thinking about how small the clicks on a keyboard could sound. Mark opened the email first. He stared at the screen, breath held, and then called Alex. Voices rose. The kids texted their spouses and showed screenshots to friends. The town began to hum. Gossip spread, and with every new whisper, the pile of suspicions grew. The effect was immediate. Mark panicked and sold an old rental property that had taken him years to secure. He wired money to accounts he thought were safe, and left a stack of signed receipts on my kitchen counter by mistake. That stack became evidence of impulse and fear. My intent wasn't blood, it was fracture. One rash move leaves marks. Banks, title companies, even local reporters noticed odd transfers. In their rush, they left fingerprints on every document they touched. That panic gave me proof that began to look like guilt. With the forged invoice and the rash sale, I nudged 2 systems that never forgive carelessness, the banks and the records office. A call placed by chance to a title clerk brought a discrepancy tied to the property Mark had sold. I didn't have to explain anything. I simply made sure the right files circled back into the clerk's stack. When someone found a lien or an unpaid tax on a parcel Mark no longer owned, it became more than family drama. It was a public problem. The day a local paper got a tip about a possible fraud on a sale, the world tilted for them. Friends who once hugged now looked sideways. Lisa posted a defense on social media, and a neighbor screenshot and reposted it. Within 48 hours, the accusation stitched itself to their names. They called lawyers, posted statements, scrubbed profiles, and begged for privacy. None of it worked the way they hoped. Alex, watching, put on the guise of a concerned son-in-law. He visited Maya at my bedside with flowers and made his concern obvious on the porch. It made him look good in front of neighbors and in front of me. But his ease made Mark angrier. The town's whispers sharpened into actual consequences. A client called Mark's construction company and asked questions. Lisa faced an inquiry at her boutique. Because people trust documents more than explanations, the mismatched contract became the narrative. And a narrative makes guilt easier to believe. As they scrambled, Alex sat closer to Maya than anyone else, appearing sympathetic. His sudden devotion looked kind. It also looked convenient, and convenience is a thing that stacks suspicion in other people's heads. I picked the moments when shame would hurt most: a granddaughter's birthday, a church auction, a graduation party. Those are times people measure themselves against others. They're when explanations fail and emotions leap. I used small anonymous notes, an unlabeled photograph left on a car seat, a found receipt slipped under a pillow. I wanted cracks to appear not just between siblings, but through marriages and longtime friendships. An anonymous envelope arrived at Lisa's house the week before her charity gala. Inside, a photo of her signing a receipt and a note that read, "Why not mention this to your donors?" She showed it to her husband on a shaky morning. He read it in silence and then left for work without a word. That silence was worse than anything he could have said. Marriages began to wobble. Alex's wife found a bank notice tucked into their mail that hinted at unpaid credit. She accused him of hiding things. Accusations multiplied. People pick sides quickly when the heat is up. Friends who once supported Mark now avoided his calls. Lisa's boutique lost a weekend of orders as women canceled over rumors. The siblings stopped confiding with one another and started making small, damaging choices in private. They were carving wounds open without knowing it. Then the plan required a choice for the caretaker. Maya received a plain envelope with a check and a note suggesting a payoff had been offered. She was placed in a brutal position: accept the money and take blame, or refuse, and face suspicion. I watched her face as she opened it, exactly as I'd imagined. She looked at the paper, then at me, and a shadow crossed her features. I had expected discomfort. I hadn't expected her to consider the consequences for one heartbeat, and that heartbeat told me she was human in a way the others had stopped being. When they reached the point where they'd do almost anything to stop the bleeding, I offered them a way in, and a way to be caught. Through the nurse, I arranged a meeting framed as reconciliation. A public apology would be the path back. A local preacher agreed to sit in the room. A social worker would witness. They wanted to believe there was a simple fix. Pride breaks faster than wallets. They came with hands out and voices cracking. Mark read a note that was half apology, half legal hedging. Lisa sobbed and tried to make eye contact. Alex practiced the right phrases. I asked them to say the words out loud and to record their apologies for memory. They did. They signed statements admitting they'd handled financial matters in ways they now regretted. They begged for my forgiveness like men admitting guilty pleas. I collected every confession and smiled like a farmer harvests grain. Then, at the moment when they expected softening, I smiled and pressed a different key. I sent copies of their recorded apologies to the people who mattered most: employers, church boards, creditors, and the local newspaper. The sound of their own words played back in rooms where mercy was supposed to live, and in a dozen other places, on phones and feeds that could not be ignored. As the confession spread, consequences followed. One child's employer called within minutes to say a position was on hold pending investigation. The plea they'd thought would heal them became the blade that cut their livelihoods. They had traded private remorse for public ruin. The final piece was the law itself. I'd signed papers, yes, but I'd also arranged a trust with conditions that looked innocuous until you read them aloud. Maya was the trustee with obligations spelled out. If any heir wanted access, they had to provide verified in-person care for 90 consecutive days and make a public retraction under oath. Simple on paper, ruinous in practice. Care is a daily grind. It costs time, reputation, and proof. I planted a decoy will in an envelope I knew they'd find. A version that made them hopeful with small bequests and ambiguous clauses they could interpret. The real will, the one that controlled IPROST, transfers and naming rights, was encrypted and with trusted hands. I had a notary, witnesses, and a digital hash stored with a lawyer across state lines. If anyone tried to swap wills, the signatures and secured proof would show the forgery. They panicked. In a final, reckless act, one child tried to steal the decoy and shred it, thinking destroying the paper would destroy the claim. What he didn't know was that every copy had a trace, timestamps, scanned backups, and a notary who preserved the chain of custody. The attempt looked like consciousness of guilt. The bank official who handled the suspicious transfer notified the authorities. The child who tried to erase the paper found himself on a record of obstruction. Instead of regaining control of the estate, he handed the court the clearest evidence of intent to deceive. The legal net I'd woven tightened around them, and their last hope collapsed into criminal exposure. They came like they always do for a family meeting. with faces practiced for reconciliation and pockets empty of real shame. I had asked the community room at the church because it was public, small enough for every neighbor to squeeze in, and loud enough that nothing could be whispered away. A local reporter arrived with a notepad. The pastor sat stiffly to one side. A lawyer from the city sat where the sunlight hit the parquet. My children walked in with damp eyes and rehearsed apologies, thinking this would be the soft ending they'd bribed themselves into. Maya sat beside me, as calm as a steady hand on a boat. She had no idea she would be the prop in the play I'd written, and that made her look human in a place full of actors. I nodded once, and the lawyer pressed a small remote into my palm. The first clip was quiet at first, Mark laughing as he signed the deed. The casual way he said, "We'll handle it." The second clip had Lisa's voice, sweet and businesslike at once, asking a buyer about pickup times for the old things. The third was a whisper. Alex, on the phone. "Don't worry, he won't remember." The room grew smaller as each recording played. The little camera I'd placed in the mantel had captured more than words. It had captured the tone, the habit of betrayal. Phones began to vibrate. A quiet ringtone became a scythe. Mark's phone buzzed, and he read it with a hand that refused to steady. His largest client had pulled a contract. Lisa's screen flashed. An HR email flagged for pending investigation. Alex's wife's name lit up with one word, message, which was followed by silence in the room as she read and stood without another step. The pastor covered his mouth. A woman in the second row began to sob. A neighbor's camera rolled. Someone from the reporter's phone called a city clerk. Subpoenas were on their way to 2 addresses before the last clip finished. The proof was procedural and cold. The consequences were immediate and loud. The state sends forms, and forms make life messy. When the last tape ended, I stood. I showed them the calendar, hundreds of stamped envelopes, each with a date and the words, "Visit considered." Birthdays, anniversaries, random Tuesdays. Each envelope contained a simple note. "I may consider meeting you today." The notes were carefully ambiguous and deliberately slow. I told them in a voice that was steady and small that forgiveness was not a commodity to be purchased with tears. It was currency I controlled. I told them they could earn nothing but the chance to try, one day at a time, under my terms. A sound rose that I will never forget. Mark's scream, raw and animal. The sound of a man realizing the only thing he wanted most, my forgiveness, might be the one thing he could never command. Lisa's husband stepped outside and didn't come back. Alex's phone kept ringing, each ring another small execution. They had expected punishment that ends. I handed them a punishment that never closes, a life spent waiting for mercy I could give and withdraw on a whim. Waiting, I learned, corrodes more than law. It becomes its own sentence. The months after felt unreal, not peaceful, just a different kind of noise. The phones I'd once waited for with hope now rang with strangers, reporters asking the same questions, lawyers negotiating settlements, a charity coordinator confirming plaques and dedications. My children's names glowed on headlines for weeks. Neighbors averted their eyes. Small-town kindness turned to small-town judgment. They split up across addresses I'd lived in my head for years. Mark moved into a cramped rental. Lisa shut the boutique for personal reasons. Alex stopped answering calls. Birthdays passed with a card or nothing at all. The house I had built stayed with Maya and the trust. Its rooms kept their echoes. Sometimes I'd hear a child's laugh through a doorway and think for a second that maybe I'd been kinder than I knew. Then remember why I'd done it, and the sound turned brittle. I won. The word tastes like metal in my mouth. I watched them fall apart the way a man watches a clock stop. Fascinated, then hollow. Meals lost flavor. Nights grew long. When the nurses tucked me in, I felt a gap where simple comfort used to be. No awkward jokes from Mark. No Lisa-made pie cooling on the sill. No Alex asking if I needed a hand. I had traded noise for silence, and silence has a long, dead echo. Then came the thing I didn't plan for. A letter from a school counselor. My youngest grandchild had lost a scholarship offer after the scandal. A donor withdrew when their name surfaced in the paper. Someone told me the child had missed a specialist appointment because the parents were fighting bills. A child who had nothing to do with our betrayals was paying the price in missed lessons. in a small medical delay, in being whispered about at school. That cut deeper than any headline. I had wanted justice. I hadn't wanted collateral damage. Standing in my quiet room, I couldn't tell if I'd served truth or simply spread ruin. The victory I'd staked my life on sat heavy and cold, and somewhere between the applause of the right and the harm to the innocent, my certainty began to crack. I gave it all away, and what I bought with that trade was their doubt. They sleep in rooms that used to be mine. They answer phones I once waited for. Some nights, I think I hear a knock that never comes. Victory taught me a new vocabulary. Empty, echo, maybe regret. So tell me, if you were in my place with the proof and the pain, would you have done the same? Be honest in the comments. I want to read what you think. If this pulled you in, subscribe for more true feel father revenge stories. Leave your answer below and watch the next episode in the playlist.